October 1947. A yellow school bus rolled to a stop on 139th Street in Harlem, its brakes hissing in the early morning cold. Among the children stepping down onto the sidewalk was a 12-year-old girl named Ruthie Johnson. Dark coat, leather shoes polished to perfection, books pressed against her chest like armor. She didn't know that 3 men had been watching her house since dawn. Inside her school bag, tucked between a history textbook and a composition notebook, was an envelope, plain white. No return address. It had been slipped under the front door of her family's apartment sometime during the night. Her mother, Mamie Johnson, had found it at 6:15 that morning while making coffee. She'd opened it with shaking hands. The message inside was typed on cheap paper. 11 words. No signature. Your daughter doesn't belong in this school. Keep her out. Beneath the text was a crude drawing, a circle with a cross inside. Anyone who knew anything about power in 1940s America recognized that symbol immediately. It wasn't a threat from a street gang. It wasn't a rival hustler making noise. This came from something older, something that wore hoods and held torches and had been terrorizing black communities across the nation for over 80 years. The Ku Klux Klan had just made a mistake that would echo through Harlem for decades. Because Ruthie Johnson wasn't just any 12-year-old. Her father was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, a man the streets called Bumpy. And Bumpy Johnson didn't negotiate with people who threatened his family. He educated them. What happened next wasn't reported in newspapers. There were no arrests, no trials, no official records. But by the end of that month, 3 men would vanish from their Bronx apartments. A Klan organizer would close his print shop and leave New York permanently. And every white supremacist group operating in the 5 boroughs would receive the same quiet message. Harlem is off limits. Touch nothing here, where the consequences won't come from the police. This is the story of what happened when hate met power. When a threat designed to intimidate instead triggered a response so calculated, so surgical, that it became legend. A story about a father, a community, and a reckoning that happened in the shadows, because that's where Bumpy Johnson did his most effective work. But to understand how one envelope changed everything, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was, and why threatening his daughter was the worst decision those men would ever make. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. By 1947, he'd been a fixture of Harlem for nearly 3 decades. To the police, he was a career criminal, arrested more than 40 times on charges ranging from theft to narcotics conspiracy. To the FBI, he was a high-level organized crime associate with ties to Italian mob families, including the Genovese and Luciano operations. But to Harlem, he was something else entirely. Bumpy Johnson was a neighborhood protector, a man who'd fought off Dutch Schultz's attempted takeover of the Harlem Numbers racket in the 1930s. A strategist who'd negotiated power-sharing arrangements between black operators and Italian mobsters when most black men had no seat at those tables. He stood 5'9", weighed maybe 160 pounds, but commanded rooms full of men twice his size. The nickname Bumpy came from a massive cyst on the back of his head, a deformity he'd had since childhood. Some men might have hidden it. Bumpy wore it like a crown. It made him instantly recognizable, unforgettable, and in his world, being unforgettable was a survival tool. By 1947, he controlled significant portions of Harlem's underground economy. The numbers game alone, an illegal lottery system, generated an estimated $50 million annually across New York City. Bumpy's share was considerable. He employed runners, collectors, bankers. He paid off police captains and judges. He settled disputes, enforced contracts, and maintained order in a community the law had largely abandoned. But he also funded community programs, paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them, made sure Harlem children had winter coats. It was a strange duality, criminal and benefactor, feared and beloved. Malcolm X would later call him a Robin Hood figure. That wasn't quite accurate. Bumpy Johnson was never sentimental. He was strategic. A strong Harlem meant a profitable Harlem, and he needed Harlem strong. His wife, Mamie, was his intellectual equal, sharp, educated, and fiercely protective of their family. Ruthie wasn't their biological daughter, Mamie's daughter from a previous relationship, but Bumpy treated her as his own. In a world where loyalty determined survival, family was sacred, untouchable, which is why the envelope that morning was so dangerous. Because whoever sent it didn't understand the rules. In Harlem, you could challenge Bumpy's business. You could try to undercut his operations or question his authority. That was the game. But you didn't threaten children. You didn't bring fear into someone's home. And you especially didn't do it with the arrogance of anonymity. Like the threat itself would be enough to make a man like Bumpy Johnson back down. The people who sent that letter thought they were dealing with just another black man who would be cowed by their history, their violence, their reputation. They didn't realize they were dealing with someone who'd spent 30 years building his own history, his own violence, his own reputation. And Bumpy's reputation had been earned the hard way. The morning Mamie found the envelope, she didn't call the police. That would have been pointless. The NYPD in 1947 had roughly 18,000 officers. Less than 2% were black. Harlem's precincts were staffed mostly by white officers who saw the neighborhood as enemy territory, a place to collect bribes and crack skulls, not protect families. Instead, Mamie called the one person who mattered, her husband. Bumpy was at a social club on Lenox Avenue when he got the message. According to later accounts, he listened in silence as Mamie read the threat over the phone. Then he asked 3 questions. What time did Ruthie leave for school? Had anyone followed her? Was the building entrance being watched? He hung up and made 4 more calls in rapid succession. The first went to Benjamin "Benny" Hines Williams, a former boxer who ran security for Bumpy's operations. Benny was built like a furnace, 6'3", 240 pounds, with hands that had broken jaws in 18 professional fights. His job was simple: shadow Ruthie's route to school. Watch for anyone watching her. Report back. The second call went to Arthur "Red" Campbell, a numbers banker who also ran an information network. Red had contacts everywhere: bartenders, doormen, taxi drivers, postal workers. People who saw things, heard things, remembered things. If someone new had been asking questions about Bumpy's family, Red would know. The third call went to Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Queenie of Harlem policy operations. Stephanie was in her late 50s by then, semi-retired but still connected. She'd fought her own war against Dutch Schultz in the 1930s and won. She knew every power player in New York, including which white supremacist groups had been trying to gain footholds in the outer boroughs. If the Klan was operating openly enough to threaten a Harlem family, Stephanie would have heard whispers. The fourth call went to Lucky Luciano's people. This one was more delicate. Bumpy's relationship with the Italian mob was complex, part alliance, part tension, always transactional. But there was mutual respect and mutual benefit. The Italians didn't like the Klan either. White supremacists were unpredictable, ideological, bad for business. They disrupted things. If there was Klan activity in New York, the Italians wanted it squashed as much as Bumpy did. Different reasons. Same goal. By noon that day, information was flowing. Benny reported that Ruthie had arrived at school safely. No one followed her. But he noticed a black Ford sedan parked near the building with 2 white men inside. They weren't cops. Wrong body language, wrong clothes. They sat too still, watched too deliberately. They left when the school bell rang. Red came back with something more specific. A postal worker in the Bronx had mentioned a print shop on Morris Avenue that had been producing flyers, crude anti-integration material. The shop owner, a man named Gerald Hutchins, was known to have Klan sympathies. He'd been arrested twice in the 1930s for distributing hate literature, but never convicted. The shop had been busy lately. New orders, envelopes, bulk paper purchases. Stephanie provided the final piece. She'd heard from one of her old associates that a Klan recruiter had been working the Bronx and Upper Manhattan for 6 months, trying to organize white residents who were angry about black families moving into previously segregated neighborhoods. The man's name was Vernon Pike, former longshoreman. History of violence. He'd been bragging in certain circles about sending messages to uppity Negroes who didn't know their place. Now, Bumpy had names, locations, patterns. and patterns meant vulnerabilities. There's a scene that gets repeated in Harlem folklore, though the exact date is lost to time. Bumpy Johnson supposedly said to one of his lieutenants, "Fear is mathematics. You calculate it. You don't perform it." What he meant was this: violence for its own sake was amateur work. Theatrical, wasteful. True power came from making people understand consequences before you ever had to demonstrate them. It was about reputation, precision, and information. You had to know more about your enemy than they knew about themselves. Then you used that knowledge like a scalpel. By the evening of October 14th, Bumpy had assembled what he called his council, 6 men who handled different aspects of his operations. They met in a back room of Small's Paradise, a jazz club on 7th Avenue. No one who worked the club front entered that room uninvited. The door had been reinforced. The walls were thick. Present were Benny Hines, Enforcement and Physical Security Red Campbell, Information and Finance Willie Clutch Montgomery, Transportation and Logistics Thomas Junie Bird, Legal Connections and Political Leverage Raymond Little Ray Foster, Weapons Procurement and Tactical Planning and Nat Pettigrew, a former Pullman porter who now worked as Bumpy's community liaison, the man who kept track of what Harlem actually needed versus what the criminals and politicians thought it needed. Bumpy laid out the situation in under 5 minutes. The threat, the envelope, the surveillance, the names they gathered. Then he asked each man for assessment. Benny wanted to act immediately. "We find these men tonight. Send them back to whatever hole they crawled out of." Bumpy shook his head. "That's reaction. I need response." Red suggested economic pressure. "We own half the Bronx numbers routes. We cut off their access. Starve them out." "Too slow," Bumpy said, "and it doesn't solve the immediate problem. Ruthie goes to school in 3 days a week. Every day until this is resolved, she's a target." Junie Bird leaned forward. "We could involve the authorities. I know people in the mayor's office. Klan activity violates the same authorities who let them operate freely for decades." Bumpy cut him off, not unkindly. "No, the law isn't on our side here. It never is." Little Ray, the quiet one, spoke up. "Then we make an example. Not of the men, of the organization. You don't go after the hands. You go after the head." That got Bumpy's attention. "Explain," he said. "These men think they're protected by their group, by their history, by their numbers. You show them they're not. You show them that their affiliation is a liability, not an asset. You make being Klan in Harlem more dangerous than being anything else." Bumpy sat back, lit a cigarette, let smoke curl toward the ceiling while the room waited. "How many Klan members operate in the 5 boroughs?" he asked Red. "Active? Maybe 40 to 60. Sympathizers? Could be hundreds. But the core organizers, the ones recruiting, distributing material, collecting dues, that's maybe 8 to 10 men. And Vernon Pike is one of them. The main one, according to Stephanie's sources." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Then we start with Pike. But we don't touch him. Not yet." The room tensed. This was classic Bumpy, thinking 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still processing the first. "We watch him," Bumpy continued. "We learn his patterns. Where he goes, who he talks to, where he keeps his records. The Klan is paperwork and ritual. They document everything. Membership lists, meeting locations, financial records. Pike will have files. We find those files. And then we make sure every person on those lists understands that their names are known. Their addresses are known. Their families are known. You're going to expose them," Junie said. "I'm going to make them understand that anonymity is gone. A Klan member in a hood is powerful. A Klan member with his name in a newspaper, his neighbors asking questions, his employer getting phone calls. That man is just scared and alone." Nat Pettigrew, who'd been silent until now, spoke carefully. "And if exposing them isn't enough? If they retaliate?" Bumpy's expression didn't change, but the room got colder. "Then we remind them that Harlem has longer memories and fewer rules than they do." He stubbed out his cigarette. "Benny, you and Clutch follow Pike starting tomorrow. I want to know his entire life. Red, find out who prints their materials besides Hutchins. Little Ray, I need 2 clean cars and 3 reliable people who aren't known associates. Junie, talk to your journalist friends. I want someone ready to publish a story if we need it. Nat, spread the word in Harlem quietly. Let people know we're handling this. No one panics. No one acts independently. He stood. The meeting was over. One more thing, Bumpy said as men started to leave. No violence unless I authorize it directly. We're not thugs reacting to provocation. We're professionals solving a problem. The difference matters. For 6 days, Vernon Pike was the most observed man in New York City. He didn't know it. That was the point. Pike lived in a fourth-floor walk-up on Brook Avenue in the South Bronx. Married, no children. His wife, Helen, worked part-time at a laundromat. Pike himself was employed at a shipping warehouse on the waterfront, though he called in sick more often than he showed up. Most mornings he left his apartment around 9 a.m., stopped at a diner for coffee, then drove his beat-up Chevrolet to various locations around the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. Benny and Clutch followed at a careful distance, rotating vehicles to avoid detection. They learned Pike's patterns quickly. Tuesdays and Thursdays, he met with 2 other men at a Union Hall basement on Tremont Avenue, Gerald Hutchins from the print shop and a dock worker named Carl Finney. The 3 would spend 2 to 3 hours inside, emerging with boxes of pamphlets and envelopes. On Friday nights, Pike attended meetings at a private residence in Woodlawn, a neighborhood that bordered the Bronx and Yonkers. The house belonged to a man named Robert Caldwell, a former police sergeant who'd been forced into early retirement after allegations of excessive force against black suspects. 7 to 12 men typically attended these meetings, arriving after dark, parking in different locations, entering through a back door. This was the network, small but organized, and like Bumpy predicted, they kept records. Clutch reported that Pike carried a leather satchel everywhere, never let out of his sight. Likely contained documents, membership information, financial records, evidence. Red, meanwhile, had been working a different angle. He'd put money in the right hands and learned that Hutchins' print shop was struggling financially. The man owed gambling debts to a loan shark connected to one of the Italian crews. That was leverage. Apply pressure to Hutchins, and he'd give up information to save himself. Desperate men talked. Desperate men cooperated. By October 20th, Bumpy had enough. He called another meeting. This time smaller, just Benny, Red, and Little Ray. They met at Bumpy's apartment. Mamie served coffee and then left the room. Ruthie was at her grandmother's house in New Jersey. Safer there until this was finished. Tomorrow, Bumpy said, we move. The plan was surgical. First, Hutchins. Red would visit the print shop with 2 associates. Not to threaten, to offer. Pay off his gambling debt in full. In exchange, Hutchins provides copies of everything he's printed for Pike and his group in the last 6 months. Names, addresses, distribution lists. Everything. Hutchins would accept. He had no choice. The debt was crushing him. And the alternative, having certain people very angry, was worse than betraying men who'd never paid him enough anyway. Second, Pike's satchel. Benny would engineer a distraction at the Union Hall during one of the Tuesday meetings. A small fire in the building's ground floor. Nothing dangerous, just enough smoke to trigger evacuation. In the chaos, Clutch would lift the satchel. They'd photograph every document inside, return it to Pike's car before he even realized it was missing. Pike would suspect nothing. Third, Caldwell's house. Little Ray had identified a problem. Caldwell was former NYPD. He'd have connections, possibly firearms, possibly allies in law enforcement who'd protect him. Direct action against Caldwell was risky, but Bumpy had a different idea. We don't go after Caldwell. We go after his reputation. Junie's journalist contact at the Amsterdam News is ready to publish a story. We feed them information. Former police sergeant hosting white supremacist meetings in a residential neighborhood. List the dates. List the attendees we've identified. Make it impossible for him to operate openly. The neighbors will panic. The current NYPD brass, who need good press with the black community right now, will have to investigate. Caldwell becomes toxic. The meetings stop. It was elegant. No violence. No martyrs. Just exposure. Consequence. The dissolution of a network through its own vulnerabilities. What about the direct threat to Ruthie? Benny asked. Even if we burn their organization, Pike himself is still out there. Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Pike gets a personal visit. From me. October 21st, 1947. 2:17 p.m. The basement of the Tremont Avenue Union Hall smelled like cigarette smoke and mildew. Vernon Pike sat at a folding table with Gerald Hutchins and Carl Finney, reviewing the latest batch of pamphlets. They were crude, badly written screeds about racial purity and the dangers of integration, the kind of material that stirred fear in people who were already afraid. Pike was proud of it. "We get these distributed by Friday," Pike said, tapping a stack of envelopes. "Focus on neighborhoods where coloreds are trying to move in. Remind people what's at stake." Hutchins nodded nervously. He'd been jumpy all week. Money problems, probably. Pike didn't care. The man printed what he was told to print. At 2:31 p.m., someone on the ground floor shouted, "Fire!" Smoke began seeping through the floorboards. Not thick, not yet, but enough to trigger immediate panic. The three men scrambled for the stairs. Pike grabbed his jacket, but left his leather satchel on the table. He'd be back in minutes once they dealt with whatever small problem had started upstairs. By the time they reached the ground floor, two other union members were already hauling a fire extinguisher toward a storage closet where cleaning supplies had mysteriously ignited. The flames were contained within minutes. False alarm. Sort of. Everyone went back downstairs. Pike returned to the table. His satchel was exactly where he'd left it. What he didn't know, for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, that satchel had been the backseat of a car 2 blocks away, where a man with a Kodak camera photographed every page inside. 47 documents total. Membership lists, financial ledgers, meeting minutes, correspondence, everything. The satchel was returned before Pike even made it back downstairs. That same afternoon, Red Campbell walked into Hutchins' print shop. He came alone. No muscle, no threats, just a briefcase. "Gerald Hutchins?" Red asked. The printer looked up from his press, wary. "Who's asking?" "Someone who knows you owe Vincent Morello $1,500, and that you're 3 weeks late." Hutchins went pale. "I'm working on it. I just need—" Red opened the briefcase. Inside was $1,500 in cash. Clean bills. Also, photographs. Copies of the documents they'd already pulled from Pike's satchel. "Here's the situation," Red said calmly. "You take this money. Pay off your debt today. In exchange, you give me copies of everything you've printed for Vernon Pike and his associates in the last year. You also shut down your shop for 2 weeks. Family emergency, personal reasons, whatever you want to call it. When you come back, you don't take jobs from Pike or anyone connected to his organization ever again. And if I refuse," Red gestured to the photographs, "then these documents, which implicate you in organized hate group activities, get delivered to the district attorney's office, along with testimony from several witnesses who'll say you've been distributing materials inciting racial violence. You won't do hard time, but you'll do time. And your business is finished either way." Hutchins stared at the cash, at the photographs, at his future collapsing into 2 options. He took the money. By 7 p.m. that evening, Red had 3 boxes of printed materials, original plates, and a handwritten list of everyone who'd paid Hutchins for Klan printing services in the past 18 months. 42 names, addresses, phone numbers. Bumpy Johnson now had more information about New York's Klan network than the Klan itself had. Vernon Pike never made it home on the night of October 22nd. He left the warehouse at 6:30 p.m., like always. Started his Chevrolet, pulled out onto Exterior Street, made it 3 blocks before his engine died. Just sputtered and quit. He tried the ignition. Nothing. Cursed. Popped the hood. A man appeared beside him while he was bent over the engine compartment. "Fuel lines disconnected," the man said. "Easy fix." Pike jumped, spun around. The man was black, mid-40s, wearing a nice coat and hat. Not particularly big, not particularly threatening in appearance. But there was something in his eyes, something that made Pike's hand instinctively move toward the knife he kept in his jacket pocket. "Don't," the man said quietly, and Pike's hand froze. 2 more men materialized from the shadows. Larger, silent, blocking both ends of the street. "My name is Ellsworth Johnson," the man said. "Though most people call me Bumpy. I believe you know why I'm here." Pike's mouth went dry. He'd heard the name. Everyone had. But this wasn't supposed to happen. The threats had been anonymous, untraceable. There was no way. You put an envelope under my door. Bumpy continued, his voice conversational. Threaten my daughter. Now, I'm a reasonable man, Vernon. I believe in communication. So let's communicate. I don't know what you're. I know where you live. Brook Avenue, 4th floor, apartment 4D. Your wife Helen works at Sonny's Laundromat on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You meet with Gerald Hutchins and Carl Finney every week. You attend meetings at Robert Caldwell's house in Woodlawn. You have 46 members in your organization across the 5 boroughs. I know their names. I know their addresses. I know where their children go to school. Pike's face drained of color. Here's what's going to happen, Bumpy said. You're going to stop. Completely. No more meetings. No more pamphlets. No more threats. You're going to tell everyone in your organization that New York is closed to your activities. If anyone asks why, you tell them the truth, that operating here became too expensive, too dangerous, too stupid. You can't. I already have. Tomorrow morning, the Amsterdam News is publishing a story about white supremacist meetings in a residential neighborhood. The article includes dates, locations, and names. Your name, Vernon. Your face. Your address. By tomorrow afternoon, every person you work with will know. Your neighbors will know. Your wife will know. I tried to speak. Couldn't. There's more, Bumpy said. I've sent letters to every person on your membership list. Not threats, just information. Letting them know that their participation in your organization is no longer secret. That their names are written down. That if anything, and I mean anything, happens to a black family in this city that even smells like organized hate, those names go to newspapers, to employers, to the people they love. That's terrorism. Bumpy raised an eyebrow. Yes, it is. But you started this particular lesson, Vernon. I'm just a better teacher. He stepped closer. Pike wanted to run. Couldn't move. My daughter goes to school safely. Every day. Without fear. Without threats. Without having to look over her shoulder because some coward with a typewriter thinks he can intimidate a child. Are we clear? Pike nodded. His hands were shaking. Say it, Bumpy said. We're clear. Good. Now, I'm going to have someone fix your fuel line. You're going to drive home. You're going to hug your wife. And you're going to spend the rest of your life being grateful that this conversation was the worst consequence you faced. Because trust me, it could have been much worse. Bumpy turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. If I ever see another envelope, another threat, another whisper of intimidation directed at my family or anyone in Harlem, I won't come talk to you. I'll come for everyone you've ever loved. And I won't be nearly this polite. Do you understand? Yes. Then we're done here. Bumpy Johnson walked away. The 2 large men followed. Within minutes, someone appeared, reconnected the fuel line, and disappeared. Vernon Pike sat in his car for 20 minutes before his hands stopped shaking enough to drive. He never attended another Klan meeting. Neither did most of the others. The story broke on October 23rd. Front page of the Amsterdam News. Former police sergeant hosts supremacist meetings in Bronx home. The article didn't mention the Klan by name, didn't have to. The implications were clear. Neighbors were quoted expressing shock. Community leaders demanded investigation. The NYPD, facing pressure, launched an inquiry. Robert Caldwell closed his house to meetings immediately. Within 2 weeks, he'd moved to Pennsylvania. Carl Finney quit his dock job and left the city. Gerald Hutchins' print shop reopened after its family emergency break, but only printed legitimate commercial work. The business folded within a year anyway. He couldn't shake the reputation. Vernon Pike continued working at the warehouse, but kept his head down. According to later accounts, he told anyone who'd listened that New York was too dangerous for their movement. Better to focus on other regions. Quieter places. Places where people like Bumpy Johnson didn't have the power to make you disappear, either physically or socially. The threatened letter campaign Bumpy mentioned was real. Over 40 men received anonymous envelopes containing their own names, addresses, and a simple message: you are known. Most of them quietly withdrew from organized hate activities. Being anonymous was the entire appeal. Once I was gone, so was the courage. Ruthie Johnson continued attending school without incident. Years later, she'd recall the period as strange, knowing something had happened, seeing her father more tense than usual, but never feeling directly endangered. Mamie had shielded her from most of the details. That was intentional. Children shouldn't carry that kind of fear. Bumpy never discussed the incident publicly. That was his way. He operated in shadows, solved problems quietly, and moved on. No boasting. No legends built around his own actions. Just results. But Harlem remembered. And the story, though details were often embellished or misremembered, became part of the neighborhood's oral history. A reminder that power wasn't just physical. It was information, strategy, reputation, the willingness to act when others only threatened, and the intelligence to win without firing a shot. Bumpy Johnson would live another 21 years after that October. He'd be arrested more times, serve prison sentences, continue his complicated dance with law enforcement and organized crime. He'd befriend Malcolm X, become a figure of myth and reality blurred together, part truth, part legend, entirely unforgettable. But people who knew him, really knew him, said that the Klan incident revealed something essential about how he operated. He didn't react emotionally. He didn't lash out. He calculated. He prepared. And he executed with precision. The strategy he used against the Klan became a blueprint others would follow. Exposure over violence. Information over intimidation. Making enemies famous for all the wrong reasons. It was psychological warfare before that term became common. And it worked because Bumpy understood something fundamental. Most hate is cowardice wearing a costume. Strip away the anonymity, and the coward remains. The Klan never regained a meaningful foothold in New York City after the 1940s. Multiple factors contributed: social changes, legal pressure, demographic shifts. But according to historians who've studied organized hate groups, the combination of media exposure and targeted pressure from community figures like Bumpy Johnson created an environment where such organizations couldn't operate openly. Fear worked both ways. And sometimes the people who trafficked in fear discovered they weren't immune to it. Ruthie Johnson grew up to become a teacher. She rarely spoke publicly about her father's criminal activities, but defended his role in the community until her death in 2006. In interviews, she emphasized his intelligence, his strategic mind, his protection of Harlem. "People want to make him a villain or a saint," she once said. He was neither. He was a man who played the hand he was dealt, and he played it brilliantly. Mamie Johnson outlived Bumpy by decades. She wrote a memoir, published in 2008, that provided rare insight into their life together. She confirmed the Klan incident in general terms, but refused to provide names or specific details. "Some victories are best left in the shadows," she wrote, "where they were won." And perhaps that's the most important part of this story. Not the confrontation, not the strategy, but the principle underneath, that protecting your community sometimes means operating in spaces the law won't go. That justice and legality aren't always the same thing. That power, when wielded carefully, can defend as effectively as it can destroy. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a hero. He was a criminal who exploited his community even as he protected it. But in October 1947, when hate came to his door and threatened his family, he responded with something more devastating than violence. He responded with intelligence, with networks, with the kind of cold calculation that made his enemies wish they'd never learned his name. The envelope that started everything was never found. Probably burned. Probably forgotten by everyone except the man who'd received it. But its consequences rippled outward, changing how a hate organization operated, protecting a child who never knew how close danger had come, and reinforcing a legend that still echoes through Harlem's history. Because some lessons you teach with words, some with actions, and some with the simple, terrifying knowledge that you've been seen, known, marked, and that the person who marked you has better reach, better resources, and better memory than you ever imagined. That's the lesson Vernon Pike learned. That's the lesson the Klan learned. And that's why, for all his crimes and complexities, people still remember Bumpy Johnson's name. Not because he was the most violent, or the richest, or the most powerful, but because when it mattered most, he was the smartest man in the room. And in 1947, on the streets of Harlem, that made all the difference.